one of the things that's of preeminent concern for the church or for anybody is establishing your own schools, right? The educational system. So, just to give you like a sense of this, in 1834 in France now, Lamennais, one of his associates named Lacordaire, and another one of his associates named Montalembert, they tried to open up their own independent private school.
Lamennais.
Yeah, this is before Lamennais had lost his faith.
Okay.
Yeah. So they tried to set up their own independent private school. They opened it up, and after 3 days, the government came in and shut them down. Right? Because why? You can't have, in the French system at this time, you can't have any independent corporate bodies. And I think what's just as a little reflection on this is that, so a lot of times, so this leads Lamennais and Lacordaire and Montalembert to be real advocates of religious freedom. Right? Because for them, religious freedom is, we got to get out from under the thumb of the state, somehow. Right? We got to be able to establish enough freedom from the state. They also, until Lacordaire and Montalembert continue on this track. And so does Guéranger, the guy who refounds Solesmes, the monastery of Solesmes. And so do a lot of their followers throughout Europe. They become very much on the side of promoting a strong papacy, as Joseph de Maistre suggested. Why? Because the majority of the bishops in their country are perfectly happy. They don't want to rock, even if they're against the strong French state of the 1830s, they don't want to rock the boat. Yes?
Sorry, can you just say again what a strong papacy would look like? Like, what would be the type of decisions that they would want to have?
So that the papacy appoints its own bishops without having to get any kind of approval from the state legislature.
So in some sense we have that now, right?
Now you could say, yeah, we have that. If we want to exercise that right, yeah, we have that. Because with most countries...
Except in China.
But even China, well, I mean, China's more like the France of this time, yeah. A strong papacy also would clearly define certain errors that should be avoided, according to these guys. Leaving, therefore, everybody free to... for example, we'll see in Germany, there's a big conflict in Germany over divorce. Over marriage. Over marriage. Whether you can marry, whether a Catholic can marry a Lutheran. That kind of thing. And a strong papacy would give them, what they're thinking is that a strong papacy would give them kind of fortitude, and it would make clear teachings of the church. So in a sense, they would know where to fight as far as promoting what's good and healthy in their country. Also, a lot of these guys, they want to rock the boat. I mean, they want to rock the boat in France, right? They don't want France to just be kind of a naturalist, either moderate naturalist or radical naturalist state. They see a lot of errors in the regime because it's too Lockean, it's too capitalist, it's too empire-like, and they want to get teachings from the Pope that would help them in their critique of the regime, because they want to rock the boat. Right? But of course, a lot of the bishops in the country, they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to say anything critical. They just want to, and in some sense, it's understandable too. Like in the French Revolution, the revolutionaries just took all the property of the church. And so a lot of the bishops are just living in this fear. Look, if we say, they might even say, I don't know if they, but you can imagine them saying to someone like Lamennais, look, if I rock the boat and I say something too strong against the regime, they're just going to step in and take away all my churches, and then nobody gets the sacraments, right? I mean, that's so close to our immediate past that I don't want to risk my neck rocking the boat. So, and also it's the case that there still are a lot of Catholics in France, in public intellectuals, and at one point there's a phrase that the reformers of the 19th century, the Catholic reformers, that they say, what is a public intellectual? A public intellectual is a Catholic who can beat all his fellow Catholics into submission. Right? because there are there are naturalists, right? There's this one guy in Germany named Hermes.
Herbie.
His last name is Hermes. Yeah, like the winged messenger. Yeah, so he's a liberal Catholic, and he's a real conniver, and he's basically able to make sure that like no reformer gets a position in any serious German university between the years like 1816 and 1830 something. And so what the reformers do, they go to Rome, and they try to get the Pope to condemn some of the ideas of Hermes, which the Pope does. And then that kind of allows them to go back to Germany and to get some faithful Catholics like into some of the university positions. Right? So there's also, so in other words, that's another reason why they want the Pope to say things. Because sometimes they feel that between the public intellectuals that are just beating on them into submission, and between the state, they're getting pinned. And the local bishops aren't helping them, and they're saying, if at least the Pope gave us a little bit of something we could go on, it would help us in spreading the universal kingdom of Christ. Now, of course, in the United States, there's a much different approach to public education, because in the United States, the Catholic Church by the 1830s, remember, at the founding of the United States, I think there were 4 or 5 million people in the United States at the founding?
3 million.
3 million? There were 25,000 Catholics at the founding out of 3 million. That would be like, now in Estonia, I think Estonia has 1.2 million people and has 1,000 Catholics,
Wow.
1,200 Catholics.
And 800 of them are punk rockers.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Anyway, so I mean, but by the 1830s, the Catholic population has really expanded a lot in the United States. And in this time, thanks to this, St. John, John Neumann, he became an early promoter of free or practically free Catholic schools for all Catholics. His vision was that every Catholic would be able to afford going to a Catholic school and getting a Catholic education. And so I think in the 19th century, so his arguments kind of won the day in the 19th century. And I think his ideals stayed in place until probably the 1970s or 80s. Like, for example, in South Bend, until the mid-1980s, you had to pay like $500 a year to go to a Catholic school. And they basically kept the tuition down by doing fundraising. Just the bishops in South Bend and Fort Wayne they would fundraise a lot to basically make sure that Catholics wouldn't have to pay a lot and they could go to Catholic schools. But I think obviously since the 80s that hasn't happened. I think because of the charter schools in Arizona, I know a few years ago the Bishop of Phoenix put together a group of priests to study the situation, to see if they could go and return in Phoenix to the St. John Neumann model of Catholic education. Just basically making it cheap for everybody. But I don't know whatever became of that. I don't know how possible that's going to be.
Are you talking about like the basis schools?
Pardon?
Are you talking about like the basis schools? Okay,
Sort of
great.
like Seton Hall. Seton Hall Park.
Because of the Great Hearts in Phoenix. So I think also, just to say it, I think also in 18, what's the general, let's just say something about this now. We got to say something about it at some point, and now is a good time. Because in the 19th century, I think there were two visions of how the Catholic in the United States. This is a little bit simplistic, but I think it captures, at least since it's an introductory course, we can be simplistic. Right? Well, only in the sense that I think there were two kind of visions of what do you do about the United States? And I think one vision was more or less the vision of the French, the Sulpicians, and the other French that came here really from 1790 or so until the 1830s, and also a lot of the Germans that came here. More or less their vision was we Catholics have a superior culture because we have, going back to when the Benedictines started to try to deal with the Lombards, right? And the Lombards were basically pig farmers and hunters, right? And the Benedictines turned them into farmers and craftsmen and helped them and basically spent 800 years trying to civilize the Lombards, right? So that they wouldn't just be pig farmers and hunters, right? So, and then in the context of doing that, created all sorts of wonderful things. Wine, beer, right? The true marks of civilization. And, ora et labora, work and prayer, right? And built up a whole civilization, right? Which obviously there's problems because from the Reformation to now, there's been a war going on. And people have been chipping away at that in different ways. But the basic German and kind of French approach was, we have the seeds of the Logos. And we don't necessarily go around all the time, but we got to have a kind of confidence that we can plant these seeds in this culture, and this culture can grow, right? And it can be, and this culture we can do with the Americans what we did with the Lombards. And so, for example, in Cincinnati, there's this one church. I forget the name of the hill, but there's one hill that's the tallest hill in Cincinnati, and the Germans, when they got there, the German Catholics said, the most important thing is that we build a church on the top of that hill. Right? So they built a church on top of the hill, and in the apse of the church, they put in German, I forget the German now, but it's basically pray for the conversion of this country. Right? And also the Germans, when they went to Ohio, the Germans made Ohio, they said, how do you give civilization to any barbaric land? You teach them how to make wine. So they actually figured, this part of Ohio from Cincinnati up to Toledo and Cleveland, it's actually just like Germany. So you can make it a wine growing region. And so before Napa Valley, the biggest wine producing part of this country was this part of Ohio that ran.
Way.
Yeah. Yes, way. They ran from Cincinnati all the way up to Cleveland, and it all got wiped out at some point later on, which I don't remember that whole story. But it was really the inspiration there was the German Catholics, right? Because this is how you teach work, it's how you teach prayer, and it's how you teach technology and how technology can be good, and how you get one of the high watermarks of civilization, right? So the other approach was more or less led by certain Irish, not all the Irish, but certain Irish. And their basic approach was, America has these good natural virtues, and we should just ape, to use the expression that seems to be growing in popularity. We should just ape what the Americans do, and eventually they'll convert. Right? Do what they do, and eventually they'll convert. For example, so one of their leaders was this guy in the later 19th, early 20th century, was John Ireland. And he was actually explicitly opposed to Catholic schools. And one of his arguments was, how could a public school ever be a danger to the faith of a Catholic? Right? That was kind of one of his universal blanket arguments against public schools. Against Catholic schools. He thought that once the public school system started, that the Catholics should just shut down all of their schools and just go into the public schools.
That's great.
So, I think at the time his argument didn't win out. But I think another thing that happens that's important to note in the and I think it was 1834 or 1836, somewhere around there. There were these because Catholic immigration was so kind of rapid that there were a lot of nativist riots. And actually there was somewhat of I forget the name of the novel now, but there was like a Da Vinci Code type novel that was written in the early 1830s, and it was set in Philadelphia. And the central bad people in this novel was an Ursuline convent in Philadelphia. right? And you can just imagine, I mean, you know, it's like a typical Da Vinci Code type plot. And so what happened was that this novel was super popular, and the nativists got so upset that they basically, in Philadelphia, they rioted. And I think they went to this Ursuline convent and they burnt it down.
What?
Right? Yeah. They burnt it down.
Are they canonized?
I don't know if the Ursuline, I don't remember now if anyone was killed or not. But there were serious, but I think there were some that were killed. But anyway, the reason I think there were some that were killed is that people were so horrified. Even the American elites were horrified at what happened here, right? That there were these riots, and because they didn't just happen in Philadelphia, but I'm using Philadelphia as an example. That they basically kind of said, we got to come up with a policy. And I think the unwritten policy of like how to deal with Catholics in this country, it was ethnic. We're gonna have a kind of ethnic federalism. I think that's the title. That's the word I would give to it. Ethnic federalism. And I think the whole idea was, look, basically the Protestants will live in the suburbs because that's where the wealthy people live, right? And in the cities, we're going to allow ethnic neighborhoods. And in these ethnic neighborhoods, they're not going to be like the Jewish ghetto of Poland in the Middle Ages, but in these ethnic neighborhoods, it'll allow the immigrants to come in, and then over the course of a generation or two, they'll move out of their neighborhoods and they'll become part of the population. But also there's going to be ethnic small towns, ethnic villages. And everyone will be able, it's kind of ethnic federalism. Everyone will be able to more or less keep their ethnic identity, keep their religion, and in a typical town there might be a majority, and that majority will kind of set the culture for that town. And but over time there will be assimilation, a gradual, over 2 or 3 generations. Everyone will identify themselves as American, and actually, believe it or not, they might even keep their own language and still identify themselves as Americans.
Ooh.
And I think this policy lasted. I think it lasted until the 1930s. This was the unofficial kind of policy of the United States for dealing with Catholics. Yeah.
Was the Know Nothing Party like a very much a minority?
Yeah, I mean they were the kind of the nativist reaction against.
They got tired. Do you think it's pretty good policy?
Pardon?
Do you think it's pretty good policy?
I think it was. I mean, I think it was a just policy. It allowed for. I think if you read in the textbook on nationalism, I think it follows the principles that are laid out in the manual on nationalism. That it respects national identity, ethnic identity, and it also allows for gradual assimilation. Right? So, for example, this is for example, Art Thalin, his first language growing up in Wisconsin was German.
Wow. That's crazy.
He didn't learn English until after the Second World War.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
He's an numerary. Right? Because he grew up in the area, he was like the last few years of ethnic federalism. Now, why was this taken apart? Now, just to give you a little, I'm just going to tell you my story, just because I like my story. No, this is my story. This is not his story, this is my story. When I was growing up, one of my first memories growing up is sitting in my grandmother's living room. I was like 6 or 7 years old, it was Easter time, and my uncles are all sitting around the living room. My grandma's in the kitchen cooking pierogi. Polish pierogi, because my grandma was Polish-Lithuanian. And my uncles are sitting in the living room. My uncles, who I found out later, at that time were founding members of Call to Action, which was like a kind of Catholic revolutionary group in the 1970s. And they were all sitting in the living room, kind of saying, your grandmothers are racist. I mean, that's like one of the first things. I didn't know what a racist was. I just remember the way they were saying, I thought, like a racist is like a ghost or a monster, right? And if that's my grandmother, I don't want to be anything to do with my grandmother, So I was always kind of in fear of my grandmother because of this. Not always, right? But so when I was in junior high, I went to this junior high school, this Catholic school, right across the street from my grandma's house. And for like the first several months there, I wouldn't go to my parents couldn't come and pick me up. And I would insist that they come to the school and pick me up, not my grandma's house. And I would just stay, and I had a bunch of friends, and we would play in the neighborhood. We'd play football, some sort of street baseball, basketball. I'd do anything though not to go to my grandma's house because she was a racist, right? I didn't know what that was, but I just knew it was a bad thing because I really admired my uncles, like because they were my uncles, So finally, like one day in 8th grade, I was so hungry. I thought I gotta get some food, So my hunger outweighed my fear. So I knocked on my grandmother's door, and she had a huge smile on her face, and it was like she was expecting me to come, and she had pierogi, and she took these pierogi out of the refrigerator. She put them in butter in a pan and fried them up, and she gave me this big plate of pierogi, and I ate it. And as I'm eating the pierogi, I'm thinking to myself, if these pierogi are so good, how could my grandmother be a racist? So then, so that was, I think, one of my first philosophical questions, right? If I ever were to write like an intellectual autobiography, I think that would be one of my first intellectual moments. And so then, so life goes on, and actually I became kind of friends with my grandmother. Like she and I became kind of buddies. And at one point we're having a conversation, and she says to me, she just looks at me, because she knew the whole dynamic of what was going on with my uncles. So at one point when I was about 18 or so, she looks at me, and she says, I know what everybody says about me. I know what they all insist. I can't explain everything just because I can't explain everything, but I can tell you I'm not a racist. I moved out of the neighborhood to protect my family. Right? So that, I just heard that, and I was still at a point where I still had super admiration for my uncles, but they never really talked to me much about these things. Well, actually, by the time I was 18, they were all outside of Detroit, so I never had long conversations with them. But that planted another question in my mind, okay, why would Grandma say this to me, and could it be true? I remember going to Notre Dame at one point when I was a grad student. So it's like a question that stuck in my mind, but that I never tried to answer fully. It was always one of those things maybe someday I'll try to answer this question. And I remember going to Notre Dame once, and this one professor was kind of going into us he was giving this diatribe in class one day about how all Catholics moved out of this inner cities because they're racist. Right? I remember just thinking to myself, well, that's not what my grandma said. And I actually kind of blurted out to the guy. I said, look, my grandma, she moved out of the city to protect her family. And by this point, I also learned another story, right? The other story was, look, I have an uncle. He was called to action. He was committed to social justice. And he insisted on staying in Detroit to raise his boy in Detroit. But once it happened that 3 times in 2 weeks, a guy came in with pantyhose over his face and knocked him in the head with the butt of his gun. He decided, maybe for the protection of my son, I should move out of this house. And that wasn't racism, And then the guy was like, no, it was racism. I have all the studies to show it was racism, So anyway, that kind of got me riled up. That's one of the things that started to get me riled up intellectually. And then basically in 2000, it would have been the summer after the gay marriage thing in Massachusetts. So 2002 or 2003.
Was it that early?
The first gay marriage thing, because it was the same time as the Iraq War. It's the same time as the Iraq War.
Which do you think is worse?
Pardon? What'd you think? What?
Is worse.
Oh, that's another question. Well, actually, we'll get to that.
Oh my.
But I have another lecture prepared on that.
Okay.
So
Take that.
so then I began doing, and I was, as my first year as a teacher, and I began doing some like research on this. And my research basically took me to John Dewey, a seminar. So don't think that a seminar that you have is insignificant, right? So John Dewey in 1914 was teaching a seminar at Columbia University. And John Dewey, by the way, was a huge promoter of public schools. And he was a huge promoter also of using public schools to get everybody on contraception. And he hated the Catholic Church because he could not figure out a way to penetrate the Catholic Church to get them to Catholics to start accepting contraception. So he apparently in this seminar, there was like 10 students in the seminar, right? And one student in the seminar was just a super wealthy guy named Jonathan Barnes, who just made a lot of money somewhere in New York, and just was taking this seminar just because he was interested in anything John Dewey had to say. So apparently in this seminar, Dewey just spends a lot of time railing against the Catholic Church. And as social scientists, we got to discover what the Catholic Church is all about, and we got to do something about it. So at some point in the course, someone proposes, why doesn't, maybe it was Mr. Barnes himself, why don't 5 or 6 of us spend a summer in a Catholic neighborhood and study it so that we can learn how to dismantle it, right? So they went down to Bridesburg, Philadelphia. It was a Polish Catholic neighborhood in Philadelphia. And basically this guy Barnes paid for them all to do like a summer study project. To basically do a sociological analysis of the row houses in the parish, and the bowling alley in the basement of the parish, and the bingo hall, and you know how all the different poles, how the whole network was put together. And basically, the papers that these students wrote at the end of that summer were all like, the biggest problem is communication. The biggest problem is there's like, the Catholics have clear lines of communication from Rome to the bishop, to the parish priest, to the faithful. And unless you can break this line of communication, there's no way you're ever going to get Catholics on contraception. Right? That was kind of the conclusion of the. But John Dewey convinced 2 of the students, Paul Blanchard and Bran Blanchard, to go into the study of urban planning and urban development. Because Dewey basically said to them, you know, I don't know how it's going to happen, but if you can go into urban planning and urban development, that's how you're going to be able to figure out how to undo these neighborhoods. So that's 1914. First World War happens. One of the greatest propaganda efforts takes place in the history of the world in the United States to get everybody on board for the First World War. Walter Lippmann describes it in his book Public Opinion. A lot of what he describes in his book Public, and Walter Lippmann was he was one of the guys who was given the task of changing everybody's opinion on the war. So it's like a first-hand account. And they would come up with like really, really kind of simplistic ways of trying to get people pro-war, like pro-American and pro-war. So like one of the things he proposed and that they actually did during the time was that in the 7th inning stretch in a baseball game, you'd have these America pageants. And they were actually going after like Polish workers. So they'd get these Polish workers and they'd have these like America machines. Right? They'd have these America machines. And they'd get the Polish guys, these Polish workers wearing like their Polish mountain garb or their Polish, whatever Poles wore in those days. And they'd walk through the America machine. And they'd come out the other side like in the red, white, and blue, you know? This was during the 7th inning stretch of baseball games. And this is part of what they were doing to try to patriotize everybody, get them into the war effort, get them on board with Wilson getting us into the war. And they realized their biggest problem actually was Catholic ethnics, right? Because of the communication lines. By the way, Paul Blanchard shifted into becoming a public intellectual. But anyway, you fast forward to 1934. You fast forward to 1934. And in 1934, by this point, 1934 or so, Roosevelt and some of his advisors, they're kind of convinced there's going to be another war in Europe. And they're convinced that we potentially could have a nationalities problem in the United States. Meaning, the Irish might not want to side with the British in a war, right? And there's lots of Irish Catholics now. In fact, by the time you get to the 20s and 30s, there's all sorts of sociology and there's all sorts of demographic studies coming out that are basically saying there's a big fear we have in this country now. And it's a serious fear. If things continue as they're going, because the Protestant elite are all on contraception, and the Catholics are having 6 kids per family. If things continue as they're going, by 1970 or 1980, this country will be a majority Catholic. So we got to do something about this, right? So the nationalities problem was not just a problem of, well, will the Irish support the English in the upcoming war? It was also that there's serious demographic concerns that if you don't get the Catholics on birth control, they're gonna take over this country, and they're gonna use democracy to implement the moral law.
That's
right?
It was right.
So in other words, they start having the exact same fears. They start having the exact same fears of the liberals from the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. That you can't have democracy with Catholics. Because, I mean, it just doesn't work, right?
Vote for the Pope.
So Roosevelt puts together a committee. Someone convinces Roosevelt that let's put together a committee for studying the nationalities problem. And Roosevelt puts on that committee the Blanchard brothers from the Dewey Seminar. Paul Blanchard, who's a public intellectual, he's a closet homosexual. He'll go on to write a book in the 1950s called American Freedom and Catholic Power. And it was so popular that every Catholic university in the United States was inviting him to speak at their university. Paul Blanchard's also someone who said, at the end of the Second World War, it's too bad that the Nazis were homosexuals and euthanizers, because it's going to take us over a generation to separate our goals from what they were doing in public opinion.
He said that?
Yeah. Paul Blanchard, yeah.
The Nazis were homosexuals.
Many of them were practicing homosexuals. Yes. And they were euthanizers also.
That I knew.
Right? So anyway, Paul Blanchard and Bram Blanchard, they get put on this committee to solve the nationalities problem. A third guy that gets put on this committee is Lewis Worth. Lewis Worth was a follower of John Dewey. He was a super activist, promoter of birth control. He thought birth control would solve all the world's problems. He hated the Catholic Church for some reason. His first job was in New Orleans, which at the time was a Catholic town. And basically, he started giving public lectures on why people should use birth control, and the Catholics ran him out of town.
Yeah.
So basically, when he got run out of town from New Orleans, the Rockefeller family heard about him, and they basically said, well, this is like a perfect guy to teach sociology at the University of Chicago. So
This is like 1910.
this would be in the 1920s. So actually, in the 1930s, Worth is at the University of Chicago. And actually, I know that if you can go to Chicago and you can read his papers. So Jacques Maritain was hired, I think, in 1933 to teach at Chicago. And at this point, Worth goes ballistic. And he basically starts forming Maritain, I think, never knew this. I think Maritain went to his grave not knowing this. Because Maritain several times tried to befriend the guy. And the guy always gave him the cold shoulder. And So Worth started organizing faculty like to make sure Maritain never stayed at the University of Chicago, just to treat him so hostilely that he would want to go. But another thing he was concerned about this problem of like, how do you undo, how from a sociological perspective do you undo Catholic neighborhoods? So he got put on this committee by Roosevelt in the 1930s to deal with the nationalities problem. And Worth, yes.
What is like the elites, like the Roosevelts?
Pardon?
What is the Roosevelts and the Kennedy?
I think Roosevelt at this.
Sanders?
Well, I mean, I think Roosevelt at this point. I think FDR. I think he very much had the attitude of like, I'm concerned with like economics and foreign policy, and something like you guys just deal with this.
I mean, but the Catholics were all voting for FDR.
Right, I don't think they knew. They didn't know who. They didn't know. I mean, this is a committee that he set up within his presidency, and Worth was not publicly, like he was very cautious about his. Worth was a secret Stalinist.
What?
Right? And he didn't let it be known that he was a Stalinist. Right? Paul Blanchard was a closet homosexual. He didn't let it be known publicly at that point that he was a homosexual. And that was like one of his ultimate goals. And Worth tried to promote contraception, but he tried to like not say too publicly that he hated Catholics and everything they stood for. Right? So and nobody knew about this like special committee. I mean, at the time, the special committee to deal with the nationalities problem, nobody knew that at this point Roosevelt was already kind of thinking we're going to go to war someday. Right? That was not yet in the papers. This was all behind the scenes kind of stuff.
34.
34, yeah. So basically, the committee gets the Worth when he goes to the committee. He basically says we got to do with the Catholic ethnics in the United States what Stalin has done with the ethnic groups in Russia. We got to divide them and divide their communication networks. But he also says, or the committee also says, well, obviously we can't do it the way Stalin did it, right? We can't just forcibly move everybody. So what can we do? We can basically use the power of eminent domain. We can use emigration, the power of eminent domain, advertising, and real estate agents to basically, just to say it bluntly, we can move black people from the South into the northern cities. We can use eminent domain, for example, to take out 100 houses from like a Polish neighborhood. We can promise the black people houses when they get to the city and a job, which we're not going to give them, right? Instead of building houses, in the 100 houses we take out, removing those 100 families, we'll promise that we'll use advertising and real estate agents to promise the black people those 100 houses. So we'll have 100 black people moving into a Polish neighborhood. We'll use eminent domain we'll say urban renewal. We'll take out 100 houses. We'll build projects for like 120 families. There'll be 200 families competing for those projects. The black people coming from the South, they'll be poor sharecroppers. Poor people always have a certain criminal element that's part of being poor, right? But we can then accuse the Polish Catholics of being racist for not accepting. And naturally, if you have 200 families that all want to live in the same neighborhood, and you only build a project, which is going to piss them all off because they thought they were going to get houses, they're going to get angry at each other. A little bit of fighting will happen. We can call the Poles racist, and at the same time, we can have real estate agents show up, and we can move them to the suburbs. And in the suburbs, we can establish, using radio and television and the theater, we can break this communication network with the local parish, with the ethnic parish. And in the suburbs, they'll become more subject to Time Magazine, advertising, Life Magazine, than they will their parish priest. So we'll break the communication networks and we'll get them on birth control that way. So the first city they try this is Detroit. In 1938 to 1943.
So your grandma was right.
The first city they tried is Detroit, in the Polish neighborhood of Detroit. The second city they go to is Bridesburg, Philadelphia.
Where is that?
It's a neighborhood in Philadelphia, right? Now, just to give you a for example, in 1934 in Detroit, and by the way they do this in Detroit is they adopt this policy through the newly minted Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Department of Housing and Urban Development oversees this first program that gets implemented in Detroit in the 1930s. It's so successful that in 1942 in Detroit there's riots. They paid this one guy, this one Norwegian guy, Gunnar Myrdal, to write a book called The American Republic. They completely wrote the book for him, and he just put his name on it. And in that book, they basically use kind of social science language to say Catholic ethnics are racists. And actually, that book eventually was used as a primary piece of evidence in Brown versus Board of Education.
Wow.
That all white people are racist.
What? So do we just sorry?
So anyway, just 2 years before HUD was created in Detroit, there was a kind of black migration to Detroit, and the Detroit Housing Authority, along with the Catholic Church and the other local churches, they worked out a perfectly reasonable, and nobody rioted and nobody got upset, integration of black people into a Polish neighborhood, right? So in 1934 or so, there was a reasonable integration that was done. It wasn't forced, and there was no violence. In 1942, 43, there's riots. And basically, the Detroit model, they thought it was successful. So they started using it everywhere, I think throughout the whole country at this point. And the vehicle was HUD. The masterminds were Louis Wirth, Paul Blanchard, and Brand Blanchard. And it all goes back to one graduate student seminar that John Dewey taught in 1914.
But you need a billionaire in the summer.
With a billionaire that paid for the research.
That's what we need.
That's right.
And
From 40 to 50.
But also, I think basically in the 1930s is ethnic federalism was called off by the elites. I think with the creation of HUD, ethnic federalism was called off. Between Rockefeller and the University of Chicago and the creation of HUD and also all the social science literature that was pointing to the demographic takeover of the United States by Catholics. I think at that point you get a shift in our policy from, the religious freedom of James Madison to more of a European style approach, like we got to do something to break up these Catholics. Otherwise we're going to get, the Catholic moral order through the legislatures.